as far as what I wanted to cover today, I, I hope everybody's read the article. I don't know if that's the case. You don't necessarily have to have read the article, but it's a review article, right? So it has a lot of kind of background information on the research that's been done on this topic, primarily over the last 20 years. That's our focus. And rather than kind of summarize all of that research, which obviously you can read the article, so I'm not necessarily going to do that. What I thought I would do is hit some of the highlights from the article, um, and do that by primarily asking questions. So I reread the article just yesterday in preparation for this, and as I went through there, what I was thinking is more along the lines of, okay, this is what we know, but what do we not know? And I'm hoping that that can actually lead to more of a discussion today than me kind of just talking about a review article that everybody can read. So that's the approach that I'm going to take. And obviously, as Lauren mentioned, feel free to drop in questions or comments or answers. Maybe you have answers to some of the questions that I'm going to be raising as I kind of go through and ask some of these questions that I have today. So hopefully that makes sense. Is that okay, Lauren? If I ask more questions than answers, okay. So some of the highlights that I wanted to just kind of point out and see if people might have some ideas on this, and then we'll go from there. Uh, the article actually starts by noting that there was a little tiny blip of research on the non-religious in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and then a huge gap. Very little research took place up until the early 2000s, and then we suddenly saw a big increase. The obvious explanation for that is that's when we started to see a notable increase in the number of people who identify as non-religious, particularly in the US and Canada and the UK. And that's also true in a few other developed or developing countries. But I'm wondering if there's something else that actually drove the increase in interest in this topic, or if it's exclusively just based on the number of people who identify as non-religious. And so that's actually a question that I want to put out for all the people who are here today. Is there something else that's driving that interest in the non-religious, or is it strictly just the increase in size? Is it a numeric thing, and so people are just adjusting to that? And I actually don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, so I'd like you to be thinking about these things, and if you have ideas, I'm really, really open to that. Second point that I wanted to talk about is, what is it that we're really studying when we're studying the non-religious, right? So the topic of the grant, non-religion and complex future, at this point, the focus has been on what we call non-religion. But I wonder about what we mean by non-religion. Non-religion, as I understand it, is more about religious affiliation. So it's identity rather than, say, worldviews. And increasingly, you hear people talk about worldviews. Worldviews is a belief thing, right? So it's what people believe or how they think about the world. Whereas non-religion, I kind of understand as affiliation. But one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading through this, are there also, so if we think about religion as having the three Bs, right? Belief, behavior, and belonging, are there also non-religious modes of behavior, right? So we've got non-religious worldviews, we've got non-affiliation, which is a kind of that's what we mean by non-religion often. Is that really what we're trying to study, right? So what should the focus of study be? Should it be on secular worldviews? Should it be on people who have no religious affiliation? And then are there also non-religious modes of behavior? If we're thinking about religion being multidimensional, is non-religion also multidimensional? And I don't know the answer to that question either. I think that's an interesting question that we need to wrestle with when we're thinking about what is it we're trying to study. Does it include all of those different dimensions? Going along with that, if we just focus on potentially the affiliation aspect, who are the non-religious, I'm really interested in that question too. What do we mean by non-religion? What do we mean by the non-religious? Do we focus exclusively on affiliation status, or does belief get included into that, and does behavior get included into that? And one of the things that I think is really interesting when we start wrestling with those questions is something that just came out in a different article, right? I cite this in the paper. I happen to be a reviewer on the article. I'm not supposed to say that, but I was on a peer-reviewed article that just came out in JSSR, talking about the declining kind of distinctiveness of the non-religious in the US. and I think this is probably true in a lot of other countries where the non-religious are growing as a percentage of the population. Whenever that's the case, when a subpopulation or a subgroup becomes a larger percentage of the population, they're obviously going to become increasingly less distinct. That said, atheists remain quite distinct in terms of educational attainment, predominantly male, socioeconomic status, a variety of different characteristics, whereas the non-religious increasingly aren't distinct. And I'm wondering exactly why that's the case. Why is it that as the non-religious grow as a percentage of the population, why is it that still a relatively small percentage identify as atheists, and the non-religious look like everybody else because they are increasingly everybody else, but atheists remain somewhat distinct? I'm interested in kind of discussing that and wonder if people have answers or possible kind of insights into those questions. Another topic that we cover in the paper has to do with religion and health. And those of you who have attended some of the recent sessions where I've presented, you know this is a little bit of a kind of pet topic of mine. I'm really interested in the religion and non-religion and health thing. I've argued multiple times in a variety of different contexts that there isn't a very clear or meaningful relationship between religion and health. And that's looking at it from a very specific perspective. And I'll talk about a different perspective here. But a lot of the research on the relationship between religion and health, and I literally just saw another one this weekend that made me pull my hair out again. They failed to control for variables that might actually matter. So healthy behavior, social support are the two major ones. They failed to report effect sizes and focus on p-values. And the one that really gets me and I think is interesting and maybe relevant to this topic today is that most of the research fails to provide a theoretical argument why something like religious affiliation would actually benefit somebody's health. In one publication, I actually gave this example, and I used the names of two close friends, even though I don't think they know I did. But let's pretend that we have two identical twins. We're going to call them Jeff and Bruce, right? They're identical twins, and it turns out they've lived their lives in exactly the same way. They're both slightly overweight. They both occasionally smoke cigars. They're both married. They both have kids. They both have good paying jobs. In every respect, they're basically exactly the same. And they even have the exact same house. They live next door to each other. Everything is exactly the same, except they were both raised Catholic, and one still identifies as Catholic, even though he never goes to church, and the other no longer identifies as Catholic. Why would we expect the one who identifies as Catholic to still be more religious than the other if everything else they do is exactly the same? So from a strictly theoretical standpoint, I've always struggled with why we would think something like religious affiliation would be beneficial to health. Certainly, if you go and you get social support, or if you engage in healthy behaviors as a result of your religion, that makes perfect sense. But from a theoretical standpoint, just having a religious affiliation makes no sense to me. So that's kind of my big pet peeve on that. But I'm actually more interested in questions that are related to the project, so non-religion and a complex future. I think we're looking at this from a slightly different perspective, which is in what contexts might religion or non-religion, and I think really non-religion is the key here, translate into variations in health. One of the topics that's come up multiple times is in hospice care. So how do those who are taking care of those who are dying handle individuals who are not religious, right? How do they interface with them? How do they interact with them? And does that translate into better or worse care if people are non-religious? What about in healthcare decision-making? I was, again, just reviewing a paper just last week that had to do with this, has to do with healthcare in a very specific context. But are there instances where healthcare providers don't adequately address the concerns of non-religious people, but are better at addressing the concerns of religious people, or vice versa? So are those contexts where this matters? And then, of course, there's health activities. So would there be some reason to think that either religious or non-religious people engage in more healthy behaviors as a result, a direct result of being non-religious? In other words, do non-religious people spend their Sunday mornings, instead of sitting in a pew, going to the gym, right? Or going hiking? And does that actually translate into differences in health? I think those are interesting questions. I don't think we have answers to all of those questions at this point. Couple more topics that I want to hit, and then again, I'm happy to open this up to questions and make this more of a conversation. We mention atheist activism, right? So activist atheists, and something that's come out in a couple of other papers, but we mentioned here, it seems like activist atheism exists as a phenomenon in societies that are predominantly religious, or potentially in subsets of societies, right? So in the US, it would be the Bible Belt in the rural South. Is that where atheist activism comes into kind of being an important place? And I'm wondering if that's the case, right? That really we only see atheist activists when religion matters. So is it the case that when religion has lost power in society and is no longer a very powerful force, that it's hard to maintain opposition to religion? And I think that's a genuine question. I don't know the answer to that question. I think there's some data out there, but I would be really interested in having that conversation about what atheist activism looks like in highly secularized countries. It doesn't even exist. Does it matter? Do we need to have atheist activism in those countries? Another example that I give here often when I'm talking about this is the Secular Student Alliance, which I know doesn't exist in every country, but in the US, these are basically student groups. They exist both in high schools and at colleges or universities, where they will set up a student organization that's a support group functionally and provides activities for secular students. I actually presented at one of their conferences and had some conversations with some of the directors, and they noted that there is no Secular Student Alliance at the University of California, Berkeley. It's because they don't need it, because so many students are secular, but they have high demand for a Secular Student Alliance at Ole Miss, right? It's the University of Mississippi. I think that's a good illustration of when atheist activism seems to be needed, and the research seems to support that. But I'm wondering if that's true outside of the US as well. Couple of other points real quick, and then we'll open this up. I have obviously done a lot of research on prejudice and discrimination towards the non-religious and towards atheists. I think we've got pretty good data on this in most countries now, and we also have a pretty good sense of what's driving this, that it's distrust. But Will Gervais in some of his research found that that prejudice doesn't exist in every country. And no one's actually published on this, but I think it would be interesting. I don't believe that the level of antipathy towards, or the prejudice towards, non-religious people and atheists has always existed in certain time periods in the same way. And I'm thinking of the secular golden age in the US, when Robert Ingersoll was the most popular speaker in the US and was speaking about secularism, in essence, which suggests to me that prejudice towards atheists and non-religious people has to be constructed. It's a social construct that has to be taught to people. And I'm wondering why it gets constructed, when it does, and what actually contributes to that. So that's another one of my questions that I don't think we have a good answer to. Last one, well, two more here. We have some pretty good research now, I think, on how people construct non-religious and atheist identities. Jesse Smith's work, who's a co-author on this piece, does a good job of talking about constructing an atheist identity. But I'm now beginning to wonder if we've focused too much on those who identify as irreligious or anti-religious, to the exclusion of individuals who are a-religious or indifferent and don't care. And I wonder where they should fall in terms of a religion, non-religion dichotomy, or if they're completely outside of it. I'll give another quick example on this. I'm thinking of a close friend of mine when I was growing up. His name's Tyler. Basically, he grew up in a nominally Presbyterian home, but everybody in his family loved to go skiing. I grew up in Utah, so everybody went skiing on Sundays. They never went to church. He had no meaningful religious upbringing, and religion was never an important part of his life. So I'm wondering today, and I've talked to him a little bit about this, basically today on weekends, he spends all of his time outdoors, rock climbing and hiking in outside, enjoying the outdoors, and never even thinks about religion. So he's completely religiously indifferent. Does that make him non-religious? Does that make him just low on the religiosity scale? Or should we be taking him off that dimension entirely and just not even thinking about him having a religious or non-religious identity when he's so religiously indifferent? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's an interesting one that increasingly we need to wrestle with. What does that look like for people who completely are uninterested in religion and never think about it, and has no meaningful kind of part of their lives? Two last points. There's very little research on non-religion in less developed countries. Obviously, that's being addressed by the Understanding and Belief program. I don't mean to suggest that Argentina and Brazil are less developed countries. They're obviously developing, and they're highly developed in many regards. But I wonder how non-religion is manifesting in some of these countries where there's just less research, and obviously that's a big topic that we talk about in the paper, that needs to happen. And then the last thing that I think we can begin to think about, both as part of this project and we talk about a little bit in the paper, is what does a future without religion look like? One of the most obvious examples, and we're starting to see this, and I think it's really interesting, is when churches close, right? So there's a growing demand for consultants who can actually come in and help churches close and then figure out what to do with the property. My favorite examples, of course, are brew pubs or microbreweries that churches get turned into those. But they're also being turned into housing, lots of different solutions with that. But more than just kind of thinking about the buildings, does religion play a core part in a sense of community and identity locally? And if that goes away, what replaces it? And I don't know that we have good answers for that at this point. How do people get community in a post-religious society? Anyway, those are all things that we raised as questions and actually kind of addressed what little we know about in that paper itself. I'm happy to take specific questions on the paper as well. But those were some of the things that I was thinking about as I read through the paper. Is we touch on a lot of these things, but we haven't answered a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions yet to answer. And so if people have ideas, if people have thoughts, if people have questions, I'd love to kind of just talk for the next, I don't know, 40 minutes or so, and see if we can push this in certain directions at this point. So that's it from my end, and then we'll take questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan. Yeah, you definitely raised a lot of important questions. So we'll open up now for conversation if anyone would like to start. All right, excellent. So Corey has a question.
Hey Ryan, thanks for that talk. In your paper, when you're discussing what non-religion is, I noticed that you made a distinction between non-religion and humanism. And I'm wondering if you see humanism as a type of manifestation of non-religion, or if it's something distinctly different, or does it all depend on the context? Because I think, if I remember correctly, Lois Lee doesn't think humanism is a type of non-religion in the UK, but Johannes Clark would say that humanism is non-religion in, say, India, for example. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that it would kind of boil down to both how we're defining both of those terms, right? Which is hard. I don't know that we have definitive definitions on non-religion. I think we have better definitions potentially on humanism, though I think that's context dependent, right? So in the US, in Canada, in the UK, I think we have pretty clear definitions that humanism is a secular worldview or philosophy, right? So a way of kind of understanding the world that doesn't involve any supernatural component, right? I don't think that that's exactly the same in India. I think it's a bit different. Similar, right, but a little bit different. Is that a manifestation of non-religion? I think you could debate that, right? Because it's actually intentionally trying to avoid entanglement with religion. And so if you look at some of the humanist manifestos, which are fascinating to read, I don't know if anybody's read those, they do a very good job of trying to actually present a worldview that doesn't reference religion in any meaningful way. It actually just kind of leaves religion out of it. So if there's no reference to religion, I could see somebody making the argument that it's actually not non-religion, right? That it's a completely secular worldview with no reference to religion. And by most of the definitely, we'll use Johannes Kwak's definition of non-religion, it has to have some reference to religion, right? So it's got to be referent to. And so if it's not, then we could argue that it's secular, but it's not non-religion, right? Alternatively, if you want to think about other definitions of non-religion, that it's just people who have no religious affiliation, then certainly it would be a manifestation of that. But I think it falls into a really tricky gray area depending on your definition of non-religion and your conceptualization of humanism. I think that's a great question, and it's one of those things that would be fun to wrestle with as to whether that actually counts or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you for that. It's something to think about moving forward. Thanks, Ryan.
Sure. Okay. Oh, Lauren, we can't hear you. Unmute.
Sorry. Thank you, Ryan.
There you go.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, Mehmet, you have a question.
Yes, you can stay there. It's up there.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we keep hearing. Yeah, you mentioned like there's a kind of atheist activism, especially in the case of the US. And I was thinking like the non-religion has kind of more passive identities that people, they don't have anything to do with the religion or religious identities. But however, when we see in the case of the atheist or atheist activism, like they're fighting against what is religious. So how we can differentiate this in the case of other non-religious identities rather than the atheist identities? Like, I mean, like, are there kind of more passive identities? For example, atheists, what they say is, okay, I'm against what is religious, or I'm against the God, or I deny the existence of the God. What about in the case of the non-religious? Because you mentioned three different categories. People who are not practicing their religions could be thinking about the considered as a non-religious, or people who are doesn't think about the religion, or who are denying the what is sacred.
Right.
So
yeah, well, I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of heterogeneity, that there's a lot of diversity in that group that we broadly label the non-religious, and certainly atheist activists would be one component or one subdivision in there. I think the biggest group actually of the non-religious, depending on the context we're talking about, is probably the indifferent, the passively non-religious who you're talking about, right? That most of the people who leave religion, certainly this is the case in the US and Canada and the UK and in Australia and a bunch of other countries, most of the people who leave just want to be left alone, right? They left, they're done, they're not interested in this anymore, they leave and they're done. It's a certain subset, and there are a couple of people who have tried to figure out who becomes the atheist activist, right? Was it people who were really religious before, or did they go all the way to the other extreme and then they become really anti-religious? And actually, the research doesn't seem to back that up, which is weird, right? It would kind of make sense that would be the case, but it doesn't. I haven't seen any good research to suggest that's the case, but certainly there's a lot of variety within there. And even among the atheist activists, there are those who, there's variation even within them, right? So there are those who say we should actually just kill religion, like all religion should die, it should be done and gotten rid of. And then there are those who we call the accommodationists, right? Who are like, well, actually, religion should probably decline, but we need to replace it, and that's fine. And so they're still oppositional to religion, but they're not like, let's just get rid of all religion, period. So there's a lot of variety in there. I think the majority are indifferent, right? And then there are, of course, the non-religious who just don't go to church. They don't necessarily find it important. They don't find it valuable. They probably still believe, right? They're sympathetic to it. All of that's kind of that big spectrum within the non-religious, and kind of teasing out the different ways that they engage with their identity, which is really in many regards a non-identity, which makes it really weird to study them, right? Because if somebody is not religious, I think it's important to recognize the term non-religious is a complete invention of scholars, right? Almost nobody identifies as being non-religious. If you were to ask them on the street, hey, what's your religion? They'd be like, oh, I'm non-religious. No one uses that, right? We created that term. We genuinely created it, and then we go out and we put people into that box, but they don't use that term. That's not their term, right? They might say none, or they might identify as an atheist or something else. But that's a completely artificial term that we created. So it's what we're doing is giving them an identity that's not an identity. It's the absence of identity that we've labeled an identity, which makes no sense. But it's helped us to try and understand who those people are, but it doesn't help them understand who they are in any meaningful way, which is kind of weird. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of variety in there. And then teasing out how people would fall into those trajectories. I don't think we have any good research to suggest why somebody might become an atheist activist versus not become an atheist activist. We have inklings of ideas that are at best correlations about the importance of religion or finding a sense of identity there, or maybe your social network. But I don't think anybody's really looked closely at that question. I think it's a great question.
All right, great. Thank you, Mehmet. And we'll move over now to Peter.
Hi. I'm going to change the topic a bit by going to your initial question, why then and now, and what happened in between. So these are questions that fascinate me constantly, and I've written a fair bit about these phase and timing things. The first one, the question though is, why was there an interest in the late 60s and early 70s? We have to start with that. And let's use J. Demarat and Colin Campbell as the examples. They're the kind of the literature examples, one from the United States, one from Great Britain. And if we look at from 68 to 71, I mean, this was high, not only high countercultural period, but it was also right after the secularization thesis became hugely popular and nobody questioned it. Post Luckman, post Berger, Brian Wilson, all that whole 60s literature was regnant at that point. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense that someone would at least look at irreligion or the non-religious. But the interesting question, well, why did that not continue? I don't know, but I can speculate that what happened instead. One of the things is that religion became interesting thereafter again. First in that period of the 70s and 80s where absolutely everybody was started studying NRMs.
Yeah, that's true.
The cults were the big thing, especially highlighted by, the big year 1979, not only Iranian Revolution, where religion seems to be all of a sudden really, really important, but also Jonestown.
Yeah.
And then we move into the neoliberal era, where from the beginning of the 80s, we have this couple of 2 or 3 decades of huge questioning of secularization thesis. This is where all the arguments against that it was always wrong and these kinds of things. So hardly a time when you would expect a lot of attention to the non-religious, because the religious seem to be generating much more interest until the 2000s. Now, as to why this upsurge of interest, again, we're right in the middle of it, so it's really, really hard to tell. But I can't get away from the simple observation that when the new atheists came along in the early 2000s, that somehow coordinates with the beginning interest in non-religion, not quite yet, and they are a strong reaction against what from the 80s to the 90s got called fundamentalism.
Right.
And then I think there's also, and this is purely speculation, I think there's one of the things that's going on is a kind of a sea change in cultural context, where over the last 10, 15 years, it seems to me in many, especially Western countries, which are the ones we mainly look at, it's become more and more okay to say that you couldn't care less about religion, and that maybe you don't even have a religious identity. I think of, for instance, that sudden change in the UK from all those people who used to say they were Christian and within a very short period of time said they weren't. I don't really think much changed among them. At least there's no other indicator that they were sort of, massive leaving of church or, whatever the case. They'd already gone.
Right.
They just stopped identifying. And then
what did that, Peter? What did that?
What did that? I don't know, but maybe it's Vatimo's events of being. I mean, it's sort of like you reach a threshold and shit happens, right? Why has the attitude towards non-cisgendered heterosexual kind of people, undergone a massive sea change in the last 20 years, when it didn't in the 34 years before? I don't know, but empirically we can make that observation. Right. So I guess my answer to the why now is, well, because.
Got it. Okay. No, I appreciate the history, though. I don't know how many people realize that there is a little bit of that blip, right, in the late 60s and early 70s that I think is interesting. But I think it's a genuinely interesting question. Obviously, the rise of the non-religious, right, the numeric growth matters, the new atheists matter. But I wonder if there's something else, right? And you're right, because we're in the middle of it right now, it's always impossible to see what's actually driving that. But I'm genuinely interested in that question. I'd like to know more about that. Okay, anyway, sorry, we've got other questions or comments.
Great, thank you. And Effie, you have a question.
Oh, I think you just muted him.
Oh,
there we go.
There we go. Okay. Now we can hear.
Am I back? Okay.
You're back.
Hi. Thanks, Ryan, for this. And so I read your article, and what I'm realizing is that there's a lack of literature, there's a lack of research on how being non-religious may be related to political, like larger macro level political processes. So if I put this in Charles Taylor's terms, there's no research apparently on the relationship between secularity 1, which is public level secularity, and secularities 2 and 3, which is like belief, and also the third one is the conditions of belief, where being non-religious becomes a possibility, right? So I was wondering if you thought this may be a relevant area for future research, and I'm approaching this from this angle. For instance, David Martin talked about the concept of cultural defense very early on, saying that if there's an external force, for instance, individual religiosity or affiliation, belief, etc., may actually remain steady.
Right.
Or there's the opposite side of the coin, where if the government becomes extremely associated with religion, and people become more and more alienated from it because it becomes associated with power. There's some research going on at the moment on Turkey, where as you know, the government became more and more religiously affiliated, the percentage of nuns are on the increase in the last 10, 20 years or so. So I was wondering, my first question is, how do you think, especially in a global context, because you said in the developing world, there's not much research on this, what kind of new novel areas might we be seeing? And the second one is just a comment related to what Peter said, increase in research on non-religious. I'm wondering if it's related to the going public of religions in the post-1980s period, in the way that Jose Casanova described it. Because if religions went more public, there's an argument to be made that non-religious groups and people also felt the need to go a bit more public to be able to say that. Well, because there was no need for it maybe in the 70s as much as they feel like there is today. So I'm wondering if that could be one way of approaching this.
Cool. Those are great questions. So on the first one, I've tried to make this argument, and I don't know, it might have been Peter who actually countered my argument at Sarah Wilkins Laflamme's kind of get together. I think you're absolutely right that there are connections between kind of the development of secularization, right? How this plays out, and global or even national level political processes. One of the arguments that I've made in contradistinction to Hout and Hout and Fisher, they suggested that the rise of the non-religious in the US was connected to the alignment of religious conservatives with the Republican Party, and that drove people out. And I actually think they're wrong. I think it's a bigger political process, right? And I think this is where Peter disagreed with me. I think that it's actually tied to the end of the Cold War. So the Cold War in the US starts, during World War II, kind of the end of that. And as a result of kind of the broader political processes, the US starts to identify itself as being a religious group that's opposed to the godless communists, right? And that's actually when we put on our currency "In God We Trust," and we put "Under God" in our Pledge of Allegiance, and we strongly emphasize how religious we are. And it becomes this really, that all happens in the 1950s, right? And we actually have presidents and secular leaders who are emphasizing religion very, very heavily in the Cold War period. But arguably, the Cold War ends in 1990, 1989, and that's when we see the sudden uptick in the non-religious in the US, right? So in 1990, it's 7% of the population. By 2001, it's doubled, it's 14%. My argument would be that there was pent-up demand for people to leave religion due to broader levels of modernization, right? So general secularization, but they couldn't do it, because if you left religion during the Cold War and said to somebody, oh, I'm an atheist, the immediate next question you would get was, oh, you must also be a communist, right? And because communism was bad, right, like that's inherently terrible in the US, then you couldn't identify as being an atheist during that time period without getting a lot of discrimination and blowback. So I think it is probably tied to that. And I think when I brought this up, maybe it wasn't Peter, maybe it was somebody else, somebody said, well, we didn't see the exact same level of growth in Canada or in the UK during that time period, and the growth doesn't happen at the exact same time. And I think that's a good kind of counterpoint. So maybe I'm wrong, and I'm perfectly happy to say like, oh, maybe I am wrong. But I don't think enough research has actually been done on that very specific question. I'm thinking mostly of the US context of the broader political processes that were involved and that have kind of triggered different movements at different times, right? Particularly the rise of the non-religious. Why do they start to grow in 1990 in the US when they could have been growing for decades before that, right? I think there's a pretty clear connection between those two, but I don't know that we have definitive answers on this. And I would love to see somebody actually write in detail and really dig into that topic, right? Is it that? And if it is that, right, if it's something like that, how do we explain some counter examples of Canada or the UK that they don't follow exactly the same time when they were also aligned in the Cold War, right? So I think those are great questions. And I don't know that we have really compelling answers to a lot of those. On your second question about religions going public, I do like Jose Casanova's work. I wonder, I mean, that's very possible. This could also be my just like not knowing enough history to know if religions were similarly public in earlier time periods. Maybe they were. Peter might have better answers on that. I don't actually know. But certainly they have become more vocal. Again, I'm thinking primarily of the US context. We have the rise of the moral majority in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. That is a very vocal and politically engaged kind of group of evangelicals and fundamentalists. And then we do get arguably a backlash to that. So it could be that that's what's going on, but does that happen outside the US as well? To what extent do religions go public outside the US starting around that same time period? Again, I don't know enough about that to say definitively if that's what's going on, but I think those are really good questions and things that we could be looking into. Yeah, so thank you for the questions. They're great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And Enrique, you have a couple of comments.
Yeah, just a couple of points. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. A couple of points regarding the Brazilian case. So in Brazil, like, there's the majority of non-religious people actually believe in God or have some sort of religiosity. Agnostics and atheists are a minority when it comes to non-religion in Brazil. And especially because non-religious is associated by the census as religious affiliation. So there's a lot of people with some sort of religious background that stop going to church or don't go that often, and they just sign the box, non-religious. So in here, non-religion is a census category that migrated into the domains of academia, media, etc. And there is actually an ongoing controversy in academia regarding the empirical frame of the category non-religion. Is it an empirical group, a natural group, or just a census category that like gathers a number of heterogeneous actors in an artificial way? There's a controversy in a sense that is this a useful category, or does it actually is it actually kind of a tricky category that kind of confuses more than it explains? And regarding the closing of churches that you mentioned, I think Brazil, it's the opposite from the cases like Holland, for instance, where churches become bookstores or cafes, etc. In Brazil, it's common to see movie theaters, commercial buildings being bought by religious institutions and transformed into churches, mostly Pentecostal churches. and they focused on like the main neighborhoods of big cities, close to places where there's a lot of public transportation, a lot of circulation of people, and there's actually a very aggressive strategy regarding that. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Cool. Yeah, so thank you for that. That I think that's great. I think at this point, 5 years ago, I probably would have sided on the other side of this debate in Brazil and said, no, it's a meaningful category and we should keep it. Today, I think I would side with the second group and say it's an artificial group, and it probably confuses more than it explains, right? So if we think about that specific context, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but we can use lots of context. Why some people are atheists, right? So they're strongly opposed to religion, and they work actively against it. They are a radically different group than the person who's like, I'm just bored at church, and it's not that I don't believe in God, right? Or maybe I was offended by somebody, which is legit, that happens. I'm just not going to go anymore, and now I just don't consider myself religious, but I still believe in all of the religious components. I'm just not interested in going anymore. Those are two very different groups. And of course, there's a lot of variation in between there. And there are, I'm sure, a lot of other things that kind of get thrown into that group. And I don't think we're really doing it justice by just labeling all of that the non-religious. I think it's too heterogeneous. Now, that said, and I do think it's important to kind of give a caveat, when the non-religious, if we're using all of those people, are a very small percentage of a population, I think there's greater homogeneity, right? They're more homogeneous. They're still heterogeneity, but they're more alike, right? But as they become a bigger percentage of the population, so once you get 25 to 30% like you have in Canada, or 50% in the UK, I think that becomes completely meaningless to group them together, right? Those people are in no meaningful way connected. Really what we're doing is we're trying to say, oh, we're going to put this label on you, right? That in essence is an identity that is actually a non-identity. What you all have in common is not something, right? It's actually the opposite of something. It's nothing. You have nothing in common, but that's what makes you similar. And I think that's a terrible approach, right? It makes sense when they're 2 to 5, maybe 8% of the population. But once they hit 30% of the population, why are we even bothering? Because there's nothing that they have in common other than they don't have something. So I think you're right that debate needs to happen. I think it's important. Early on, when we start to get the growth of the non-religious, it's important to have that category. But later on, I think we need to do a much better job of thinking about who those people are, what they are, and how they differ within that kind of broad category. And as far as your kind of observation, that religions are buying buildings instead of going the other way, right? Obviously, that's a different context where religions are still growing. I do like to point out, though, that the reason why they're able to do that, and I don't know this specifically in the Brazilian context, but in the US, they certainly can, is because they get huge tax benefits, right? So how could they possibly be buying those massive buildings without the tax benefits that they get because they don't have to pay property taxes, which I'm assuming is the same in Brazil as it is in the US. And that, yeah, absolutely. That's the only reason that they're able to afford that, right? In the US, we would have far more religions closing down congregations if they got no tax breaks. So it's a tax break issue that I think is, it gets into personal issues, but I think it's an important component and piece to this whole big puzzle, is why religions continue to get as much privileging as they do in society. So great points. Thanks for those questions and comments.
Excellent, thank you. And Peter, we'll go back to you. Let's see.
I'm going to pass because I see there are a couple of people next to me who have not had a chance to talk, so I'll just pass for now.
Oh, can't hear you, Lauren.
There we go. All right,
Yeah,
Peter, you have
okay.
a question?
Yes, I'm from Argentina, so our context is pretty much similar to the comments that said Enrique.
Mm-hmm.
We have a growing amount of people who do not identify as religious, but most of them are believers.
Right.
And I have a question related more with the behavior axis. I read your paper and I found it really interesting. But you mentioned it that probably we have a lack of data regarding non-religious behavior in every day.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I read something about passage rate and rites as weddings, or we have a lot of data here regarding advocacy or activism. Could you go a little more about what you're thinking about non-religious behavior in every day? Maybe you could send us a clue. Just think few questions.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question to ask for clarification on what I mean here, right? So on the three dimensions, we've got belief, behavior, and belonging. And I think it's pretty straightforward to say, okay, people can have beliefs that are secular beliefs, right? That have to do with very similar kind of questions and topics that religion deals with, right? So meaning in life or purpose or things like this. And then as far as affiliation, either people are affiliated with religion or they're not. We tend not to think about other affiliations, right? So it's an identity issue. And then on the behavior one, I think we've got pretty clear understandings of what are religious behaviors, right? So like you mentioned, you could have a Catholic baptism of children or something like that, right? It's clearly some sort of religious behavior, or maybe regular prayers if you're Muslim, or any number of things that could be religious behaviors. But as soon as you step away from that and say, okay, well, those are religious behaviors, and we have secular or non-religious worldviews and secular and non-religious identities, maybe. But if somebody's not engaged in religious behavior, is all the rest of it secular behavior, or are there any behaviors that we could say fall into Johannes Kwak's kind of relative category or definition of religion, of non-religion, right? That they're behaviors that are not religious but related to religion. And I don't know that anybody's done a good job of kind of clarifying that, right? So certainly we have secular weddings and secular funerals, different secular ceremonies, right? But are those non-religious, or are they just straight secular and have no connection to religion? And why do we assume that they should have a connection to religion? So Hugo, I think you've got a great question here, and I wish I had an answer. That's part of the reason why I'm asking the question, is I don't know that I have an answer as to what would count as non-religious behavior, right? Because it almost seems like there are clear religious behaviors. Like, I think we all understand those, but as soon as they're not religious, does that, can something still be related to religion as a behavior, but not be religious? And I don't know. I genuinely don't know. So maybe if you were trying to say, okay, well, let's take a wedding ceremony, right? That we've got some religious people in attendance, we've got some non-religious people in attendance, but we're going to make it primarily non-religious. So it's almost entirely non-religious references, but there's going to be a sop to grandma who's religious, right? Well, we're going to light a candle and maybe have some reference to God or something like that. That's gray, it's fuzzy. I'm not sure whether that would count, right? But what does it actually mean for something? Because I think that's important to think about, right? If we've got a religious category, we should have a non-religious category too, maybe. I don't know if that's true. But if something's religious, then something has to not be that as well. And I don't think anybody's really explored what that means as far as behavior goes. I think we're good on belief. I think we're okay on identity. I don't think anybody really understands what that means for behavior. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody else here has the answer. And if you do, like, pipe up, let Lauren unmute you, and you can answer this for all of us, because I don't have an answer to that. I don't.
Thank you.
No takers?
No, not this time. All right. Thank you, Hugo. And let's see, Lori, you have a couple of comments.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. This is really interesting. And what's also really interesting is the collection of people who are engaging in conversation. It's nice to be with everyone. Ryan, just a few things. I wanted to mention Crystal Manning's book, Losing Our Religion, which I know you know well. But she goes through a number of categories of non-religious people, including secular humanist, indifferent, seekers, etc. So I just thought I'd mention that and wondered if you wanted to comment on that. The other thing, I have a couple of other things. I'm just going to cheat and slide a whole bunch of stuff in here. You refer to atheists as predominantly male, and I'm always quite intrigued by that statement. Admittedly, statistically, the number of men do outweigh the number of women. But I find it interesting that almost in any company I'm in, people refer to that as predominantly male, but I fear that that discounts the number of women who are actually identifying as atheists. It's a tiny little point, but I want to encourage you to maybe think about another way to talk about that. And again, I don't want to engage in the battle over bodies here, but I do think it dismisses those women who do share that identity. And I mean, you can comment on that if you want. I loved your end question, how do people get good community in a post-religious society? And I wanted to just say about that, I think we need to start thinking about the notion of community more seriously and how we have traditionally defined that as sociologists and social scientists, because I fear that we have actually, when we think about religion and non-religion, modeled ourselves around church communities. And community, especially with social media, is taking a whole new shape, and there are other things that people are activist around or engaged around. I don't even want to use the word activist. So I wanted to make that comment. And then finally, your question about the indifferent is an intriguing one. And I know that you're referring to Johannes Kwak's work here. But I'm thinking about something, you know, we're focusing a lot at the individual level. And of course, as sociologists, we want to think about structural change in social processes. Something has changed. Something has changed dramatically. And it goes to the idea of buildings that are being repurposed. It goes to the idea of shifts in behavior as a collective. Things are looking differently. Social institutions are changed. Social institutions that have been based and formed on Christian, in all of our cases, I think, on Christianity and so-called Christian societies, social institutions are starting to shift, albeit slowly, and you tap into this a bit when you talk about health. But I wanted to just pull us away from that belief, behavior, belonging bit, which I do think is important, but let's ask bigger questions about structural changes, and then I think we don't have to get caught in that quagmire of religion, non-religion, secular, but we can start to think and ask questions about what's changing on our social landscape. And it's really quite interesting. I know we all share that feeling that there's something really interesting happening. So those were my kind of brief overview of my thoughts.
Awesome. Yeah, so two quick responses to that, and then I know we have a couple of other comments that people want to make or questions. On the atheist or predominantly male, I think that's a great point, and I think Penny Edgell's recent paper looking at basically she's trying to address the question of why consistently women are seen as being more religious, and her argument is that this is all kind of based on risk-taking behavior, that for certain men in particular, right, they're able to take the risk of identifying as an atheist, and that's why the numbers come out the way they do. And women who may actually be atheist are less willing to take that risk because of the consequences to social status, which I think is a great point, right? And I think it goes close, maybe not entirely, to the point that you're making, which is if we continue to say, oh, well, atheists are predominantly male, we're missing the sizable, I mean, even in our most kind of, our best estimates, it's still a 60-40 split, right? Some places might get 70-30, but it's still 40% of atheists are women. We should not minimize that, right? And the reason why those numbers come out the way they do is suggestive of broader social and structural issues having to do with discrimination and prejudice towards atheists and women, which is kind of an intersectional argument. So I think that's a great point, that we shouldn't kind of just focus on male atheists. In fact, I don't think we should at all. But I think that's a great point. And then on the you had a bunch of points there, but on the structural changes, I think that's a great point. I don't mean to kind of make this personal in any way, but I'm thinking back to when I left my religion, right? I grew up Mormon, for those who don't know, and I'm not anymore. That was a big deal. That was like a huge, huge deal. And I think it probably still is to some degree when people leave, but I don't think it's nearly as big of a deal today as it was 20 years ago when I did it, right? And I think you're onto something when you say there are structural changes. People don't really seem to care so much anymore. Right? When people say, "Oh, I left. I'm just not that or anymore." In certain contexts, in certain societies, I think that we need that caveat there. But certainly something structurally has changed to where this is just maybe it's a broader collective value change that people are like, "Oh, yeah, I guess people don't have to be religious. Like, it doesn't matter." But you're right to point out that structurally things have changed in a meaningful way that has resulted in some serious differences. And then bringing that back to community and how we define community, I think is a really good idea. We need to think more about that. I'm taking notes so I can think about that. So thank you, Lori. Those were great comments.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right. Yes, great. Thank you, Lori. And we'll go over now to Hannah. Let's see. All right.
Hello. Hi. So I just had some thoughts on can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I had some thoughts on the non-religious behavior questions. I really do think it is a really hard thing to study, if not impossible. But I'm a master's student, and what I'm focusing on right now is a podcast called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. And it's essentially, what they're trying to do is treat the Harry Potter books as sacred by appropriating religious ritual and applying it to the Harry Potter books. And in doing so, they kind of change the ritual. They try to make it secular or non-religious. And so I just kind of saw that as like a pulp culture example of just people being like, hey, I'm not religious, or I'm an atheist. Like, a very clear like identity as an atheist, but I'm still wanting to make meaning and find that this text is helpful. And so they're doing that. Or another example would be the Advent Project, which is a Facebook page on Instagram where kind of following the Christian Advent season, every day they're posting a non-religious Advent post, if that makes sense. So kind of weird examples of non-religion trying to be a thing, but not really understanding how to be a thing outside of religion. And in particular, what I'm noticing is they kind of just, even when they're trying to turn the practice into a non-religious practice, it kind of becomes Christian in doing so, at least in the American context. So just things to think about, and how non-religious behavior, I argue, is existing in pop culture, but they just aren't quite sure how to do it, if that makes sense. People are doing things that look like religion, but aren't trying to be religion, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think those are great examples. I guess the quick response to this, even though I have a couple of really fun responses here, is as soon as it crosses out of being religion, does that automatically make it non-religious because it has the trappings of religion? Or is it now secular and it has no relationship to it, right? So I ran into trouble once when I described my morning coffee making as a ritual, right? The editor of Free Inquiry gave me a really hard time. He's like, "What do you mean it's a ritual?" And I was like, "Well, I make my coffee, but I do it the same way every time." Just because something is a ritual, does that make it religious? Right. So I think that's an interesting one. And then I've actually, just a side note on the Advent stuff. Just this year, I saw Advent cheese and beer calendars, which I thought were great, right? Because you have to wonder, like, is it religious anymore, right? If it's about cheese.
Right.
That should be the title of a paper. That's great, right? I love that. So you're right. I don't know the answer to this. Those are great questions. No, Lauren, unmute your mic. There we go.
Got it. All right, so yeah, that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Hannah. So yeah, a final thank you, well, 2 thank yous. Thank you everyone for taking part in this Meet the Author session. I think some really interesting and important questions were raised. We had a really great discussion. And then yeah, final thank you so much, Ryan, for taking the time to be here and sharing your research and expertise with us, and kind of also sharing with us some of the things that you're thinking about.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I think I can speak for everyone. It's left us a lot to think about. So yes,
Good.
thank you. And I hope everyone has a great day.